I'm Connor Wold, and welcome back to the second part of the top 10 of the 2010s, a brand new series I'm doing every single week where I talk about some of the best films of the decade. Last week we talked about the top action movies, going from the list 10 to number 7. This episode is going to be dedicated to the movies from 6 to 2, before next week where I have a sole episode talking about what I think is the best action movie of the decade. But of course, this is not the end of the series. We're going to be doing all different kinds of genres. We're going to be doing romance, we're going to be doing sci-fi fantasy, and breaking down to the similar format where we start with honorable mentions and my 10 to 7 picks. Next week, you have to stay tuned for 6 to 2. And then the week after that, of course, will be the number 1 best of the decade. We're going to be doing different genres, but I'm thinking about branching out to doing a little bit more abstract topics as well later down on the road. Something like top 10 filmmakers, or even just top 10 performances, or even maybe a spin-off episode where there's just the top 10 most important movies, the movies that I think are going to last the longest amount of time, even if they may not be my personal favorites. But that's all to come, so subscribe to the channel so you never miss a beat. But I think we should jump into right at the top, starting off with my number 6 pick for the 6th best action movie of the 2010s. It is Skyfall.
Everybody needs a hobby.
So what's yours?
Resurrection.
With a new Bond coming out in just a few months, we can actually now reflect on the brilliance that is Skyfall and the sort of legacy that Daniel Craig had. He is now the longest standing Bond in terms of time, not in terms of movies, but he is really, especially for someone of my generation, been my James Bond. It wasn't sort of the ideal, sort of traditional smooth talking Sean Connery. It is the more grizzled, veteran type that was rebooted in the brilliant 2006's Casino Royale. But in my opinion, Skyfall is the height of the Daniel Craig Bond, because while Casino Royale was great as this young Bond who's rebooting everything, and it was great at the time, and it's a really great movie that holds up and has amazing action sequences, Skyfall I actually think works out really well within the Bond lexicon, and I actually think it's one of the best Bond movies. Now, I haven't seen all of the Bond movies, but this one, being 8 years old now, I still think holds up and looks just as good as it did back in 2012. And I think that's in a large part to the brilliant work of Roger Deakins on this film. Roger Deakins, if you don't know, one of the best cinematographers of all time, just won for best cinematography for 1917. A couple of years ago, won for best cinematography for Blade Runner 2049. I mean, even later into his life, he's making incredibly shot movies. So this movie almost has to make this list because you have one of the best cinematographers almost of all time, and this may be one of his best shot films. And that really elevates the idea of what was always perceived as a James Bond film. I mean, in a lot of ways, they're big sort of populist entertainment in the past, but they weren't really as well respected as something like Skyfall, which ultimately ended up winning 2 Oscars. So while it didn't become like this big Best Picture hope that maybe they all thought, it's still sort of a prestige kind of a Bond movie. That could be sort of a dirty word in terms of it not being true to the Bonds, but I actually think it elevates in a lot of senses. It just means, oh, let's hire the best cinematographer working in the world right now and make him shoot this incredible movie and let him do some unique things. I would say that a lot of his compositions in this film are almost Gordon Willis-esque. If you don't know who Gordon Willis is, he is, of course, the cinematographer of movies of The Godfather, for example, and did a lot of stuff with Woody Allen. He was nicknamed the Prince of Darkness, and I think Roger Deakins is actually channeling him in a lot of ways. Of course, you're thinking about the great skyscraper fight, which the beautiful silhouettes that he has, which is, you could say seen before, but Roger Deakins lights it in such a unique way that really brings intense visceralness to it, but also just a stunning contrast between the silhouettes and then sort of the neon kind of city. And then the climactic barn sequence where the barn is this singular light source of this bright orange, and then everything else, because it's pitch black in the farm country, there's no lights, it's very dark. I mean, strong blacks and with that singular light source. Roger Deakins is doing a lot of things, and as a result, he makes it have the traditional Bond, sort of slick, smooth, sort of traditional international globetrotter look, but then also confronts these elements that the themes of the movie are trying to confront, which is his more grizzled nature now, him being an older man than he was even back in Casino Royale, the darkness that is within James Bond. And I actually think those are some of the themes that the film explores. It explores, it's not just sort of an action movie. Of course, it is beautifully shot, and then I actually think there's some great writing in terms of what it's trying to say within the Bond universe, that he wants to die. He fakes his own death. He's somebody who is struggling with whether Bond is someone that is someone else, like that's his job, and then, James Bond the person, or are they two interconnected? Can he really escape this life for this long? Once you take away this life because he's so connected to him, what is left? And maybe he has to do this job even if it kills him, because it's sort of a dedication to country, but also to personal self. But speaking of that writing, I actually think there's some great writing for all the ensemble. But of course, you have to start off with the great Bond villain, one of the best Bond villains, played by Javier Bardem, Raul Silva. And what Javier does here is make a performance that is completely different than everything else. Sometimes you would say it's bad that if a performance is totally out of the movie and not in tone with everything else. For example, you would say Tom Hardy's performance in Venom, while crazy and interesting, is totally different than what everyone else is playing. But this case, I actually think it works very well, because Javier Bardem is foreign in a lot of ways. He has this strange bleach blonde hair. He's a criminal with a mysterious past, and that just makes every sort of nth of his word, and his presence brings almost tension, and that's an incredible job done by Javier Bardem. I think we give him so much credit for something like A No Country for Old Men. His performance in that is a great villain, but also we have to not forget about Raul Silva doing something completely different, but also just as menacing, just as cunning, and just as ruthless as a Bond villain's ever been. And then the other members of the cast, Judi Dench and Ben Wishaw's Q. I'm thinking about the art scene with Ben Wishaw and James Bond, just the back and forth, interlacing themes of ideas and purpose, with also sort of giving you that mission, that sort of smart, sharp writing that sort of propels the plot. And there's some great action sequences. I mentioned the skyscraper sequence, the barn chase as well, the opening on the train. There is a lot of these great sort of James Bond set pieces, but that's not almost why I would consider this so high on the list. It's because it has great action, yes, but also explores a lot of themes with it, has incredibly sharp writing, an awesome villain, which, always want to have it within a great action movie, whether it be Hans Gruber or the Nazis, Indiana Jones. There's always going to be sort of a big bad foe, and Javier Bardem definitely does that. And then, of course, just for the fact that it's so stunningly beautiful that you can watch this and enjoy it without any sound on it, if you're watching over an airplane, for example. Skyfall is one of the best Bond movies, in my opinion, and definitely deserves a spot on this list. Then, my fifth pick is going to go to John Wick, Chapter 2.
The man, the myth, the legend. John Wick. You're not very good at retiring.
I'm working on it.
Now, I could have put another John Wick on here easily because it's one of the defining action franchises of this decade. But I guess I'll take this opportunity to say that for most of these lists, especially when we're talking about franchises, I'm going to be talking about just one movie from the franchise. So if I talk about a Star Wars movie, it's just going to be one from the recent amount. I don't really want to do overlap, because then sometimes the conversation for John Wick 2 will be similar for John Wick. So that's just to note that this is sort of the John Wick entry, but in a lot of ways it's representative of the entire John Wick trilogy. But despite that, number 2 definitely is my favorite. Now, in terms of the history of John Wick, it has made an incredible impact on this decade. And I think, aside from one maybe glaring omission, but in terms of a pure action franchise, John Wick is the action franchise of this decade. It started off as sort of a cult favorite that did well at the box office, enough to make that number 2, but then when John Wick Chapter 2 made a bunch of money, now it became this mainstream thing. Not only did it revive Keanu's career for the seemingly 5th time, it also created a really intense fan base of people who love this movie and changed a lot of the industry's expectations of action movies going forward. So much of the 2000s was dominated, of course, by Jason Bourne and the idea of the shaky cam or the conspiracy thriller. Taken would also sort of fall into that basket, I'd say, where the camera, especially, shaky camera means that there's lots of cutting, it's intense and visceral and try to give you that realistic feeling of being in that fight. But John Wick has sort of influenced the next generation, which is, I think, maybe partly inspired by movies like The Raid, where because Chad Stahelski, the director, was a stunt coordinator and worked with Keanu Reeves with The Matrix and other movies, he knows stunts really well. As a result, the movie is often shot in these wides, often shot in these long one takes that actually show the stunt take and the stunt works doing their amazing jobs, because you can easily hide bad stunt work with shaky cam because you're not 100% knowing what's going on. But what John Wick decided to do, especially with Chapter 2, is show off these almost balletic action sequences with these stuntmen, with doing either a long take to show everything, they, calling it the gun fu, where actually incorporating guns into the fighting. Things like that weren't available for, because often John Wick doesn't have any squibs, so there's not actually fake blood. It's all digital blood, so they're able to do a little bit more choreography and do it that way. But Keanu Reeves is an incredible fighter, and they're able to use him really for his best attributes. Keanu Reeves is not so great when he's trying to do these big, dramatic, maybe Shakespearean, much ado about nothing kind of a roles. He's much better when he's sort of that silent killer. He's sort of the audience protagonist, whether it be something like Matrix or even something like Point Break. I think that he's the audience conduit in a lot of ways, and this works definitely for John Wick. He has just enough motivation for you to care, so you care about him, and then Keanu Reeves really is a star, reviving again, like I said, performance as John Wick. But personally, why I went with John Wick Chapter 2 is where the first film had these great action sequences and really established kind of the lore of John Wick and really the lore of the universe of the hotel and the assassins and everything. John Wick 2 just really expanded upon that and did it in a really smart way, where they gave you enough but not a whole lot. They didn't go to a huge exposition on everything. They understood that it's still kind of mysterious, but they still wanted to give you more, just more within the hotel, which, sequels, we always forget, sometimes are really hard to do. So the fact that they nailed John Wick 2 so much is really a testament. So I really like the more sort of balletic action sequences. I think they're more well done in John Wick Chapter 2. Of course, you have sort of the European location, a great ensemble cast in my opinion, with Common and Ruby Rose. That final sort of mirrors fight is really exhilarating and interesting, similar almost to the end of John Wick Chapter 3. But just having these incredible stunt fighters going with Keanu and seeing the incredible work that they do and how it looks so realistic and how they're doing flips, and it's almost like a dance in a lot of ways. So they do that, so they expand on these action sequences, and they're allowed to do more sort of bigger ones, whether it be, in the tunnels I believe in Italy, with the shotgun, and you're with John, and he's counting the bullets and things like that. It's very interesting to me. And then, of course, the lore of the hotel, actually trying to learn more about it, and I just love that idea. There's an assassin's hotel, and there's these sort of coins that you can use, and marks of death. That's what brings John Wick back. So using the lore as a reason to bring John Wick back, the blood oath, all these little things that make John Wick more than just a traditional action movie, and really totally define the way we think about action, whether it be a movie like Atomic Blonde or I think Vin Diesel's upcoming Bloodshot. A lot of these movies have been inspired, and we haven't even talked about the sort of look of John Wick, where I would say Jason Bourne and the 21st century movies often were realistic and muted sort of grays. John Wick really embraces these purples and these blues, these neon signage, and they sort of embrace the classical with the modern, that fusion. I mean, just look at John Wick Chapter 3, where he's riding on the horse, and literally everyone from the planet is coming after him. It's that sort of great balance between the old past, that sort of the warrior aspects that John Wick I think actually represents, with the sort of new modern world that John Wick is still sort of clashing with. Incredible lore, some of the best action sequences and stunt work and stunt fighting that you'll ever see in this decade. John Wick series, if you've seen them, you know what I'm talking about. They're awesome. Gung Fu all day. That's why my choice was John Wick Chapter 2.
As the world fell, each of us in our own way was broken. It was hard to know who was more crazy. me or everyone else.
So Mad Max Fury Road, what can I say that hasn't already been said, just because so many people think of this not maybe as the best action movie of the 2010s. If this is not the consensus pick, I don't know what is, but some people consider this the best movie of the 2010s. Now, Connor, why is it only at number 4 for you? Really, guys, as much as I like to do these lists and ranking, it's kind of hard to decide which one's 5, which one's 4. When we're coming down to these sort of top 5 and really top 10, the point of these videos is to show you 10 great movies that I like, that I want to break down and analyze and really discuss why I think they're such great movies and why they've had such an impact on this decade. So you could argue in the comments, oh, I can't believe Mad Max wasn't number 1. Why was it number 4? Why was this number 3? And blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I just want to highlight these are great movies. There's not a lot of differences. Ultimately, maybe it comes to personal taste and personal preference. That I'm not saying even Mad Max is the 4th, not the best movie in terms of quality, you could even say, because it's so hard to judge a lot of these movies, even within the same genre. So ultimately, just know that even though Mad Max is, say, number 4 here, and it's not number 1, I still love the movie. It's a great movie, and all these movies are highly recommended on my list, and I definitely think you should check them out. And if you haven't, we can discuss in the comments. If you have, tell me about why you like Mad Max, and why maybe Mad Max is your number 1. For me personally, it's just the number 4, but I just want to stress that I'm not going to go back and forth between why this was better than that. I just really want to use this platform as a way to celebrate some of these great movies and talk about my opinions and how they've impacted me. But going into the analysis, what I find about this movie is that it's a great example of pure cinema. Now, pure cinema is this term coined by Alfred Hitchcock, which is the idea that stories are pure cinema is a story or a film or sequences within films that are told, that can only be told through cinema, that they couldn't be told in a book, they couldn't be told in music, that it's a combination of the moving images along with the music to create this pure sort of storytelling moment. So, of course, the obvious example would be silent film. That would be considered pure cinema because it couldn't be told, for example, in a book, where oftentimes if you see something like an Aaron Sorkin movie, as much as I really like those movies, theoretically they could be written to books, less as good books, but still, because there's so much of a dominance on the written word. But something like Mad Max Fury Road, I think, is pure cinema because it's totally about the visuals. It's totally something that you wouldn't be able to get the full effect if you were to, say, describe it in a book or hear it in music. It is the combination of these epic, sort of grand music pieces along with a visual storytelling of how the camera moves, of how one shot to the next shot tells you something in terms of character motivations and looks. And this movie just has these long sequences of no dialogue, of just action sequences, because it doesn't really have a really complicated plot. It is essentially a chase film where they go to one place and then they chase back, essentially. It's very linear in that sense. Now, is there themes that George Miller incorporates? Absolutely. I think there's a lot of themes throughout the movie, things like feminism and authoritarianism and reliance on structure to have meaning and fanaticism, and then environmental degradation. I mean, these are all themes I actually think are within this movie, but are never, I would consider, the main plot. They're sort of just alluded at, they're part of that, but for the most part, it is just a chase movie. So when I'm thinking about scenes I like, it's almost like, well, there isn't a lot of necessarily scenes, but there's often great moments. And I think James Cameron and even someone like a Steven Spielberg are great at creating visual iconography. When you see something like E.T. flying across the moon, you know that's going to be something. When you see something like, T2, and he's on the motorcycle and he's got the glasses and he's pointing the gun with John Connor and him, you should know, like, oh, that's an image. That's going to be something that's going to be burned into the minds of cinemagoers for the rest of our lives. And I think George Miller does a lot of visual iconography within this film, whether it be the guy on the truck with a guitar that's flaming, whether it be Charlize Theron on her knees yelling in that sort of beautiful wide of her in the desert. The colors in this movie, especially in something like that shot, the bright and yellows and oranges, and just like, it doesn't look like a normal desert would look. It's a heightened version of that. In the Mad Max world, to come back all these years later with the same director and do something unique and different and really even expand that world out even more, it's just a great testament to what he's done in the past. But this is a pure action movie. As much as I like those themes, as much as I like sort of the great color incorporation, it is an action movie. But how do they keep you interested? There's great action sequences, but you also have to be able to watch it and understand the stakes and be invested within, an hour and 40-minute movie. So what is it about this film that is able to do essentially a 1 hour, 40-minute chase sequence? Well, I think it has to do with editing, or more generally, the pace of the film. Now, I think that's something that is often alluded to, like I didn't like the pacing, or the editing was a little bit weird, but that's sort of the extent of the analysis, when really, that's a huge part of the process. So many people will say that the editing is actually where the film gets made, that they do pre-production and they film, but the editing is actually the most important stage. It's where you find the film, it's where you craft the story and craft the narrative. But what's actually, I think, is very common with some of the best films of all time is their correct pace. I'm not saying fast pace necessarily. Something like Parasite's a great movie, but a lot of reason why it's great is just because of how the camera moves, of how it's one scene moves to the next, and you're never bored, and that has to do with incredibly meticulous focus and detail on pace. The same way George Miller is so interested in every shot, even if it's a quick sort of action shot. It's very clear in its storytelling that they'll show you a car's moving from one side of the screen to the other, and then when they cut to a shot of Furiosa, then they see her looking up, then she sees in the rearview mirror that there's someone chasing her. Now we know that the action's going from left to right, so they're never going to cross lines in certain ways, or if they are, they're going to take time to do it. That we understand the action, that there's these cars and they're chasing this car, and we know that if they go out of this window, there's going to be this car on this side. And that's an incredible amount of complexity, but when you watch the movie, it makes a lot of sense, in my opinion, that the action is very clear and that the pacing is always exhilarating and enthralling. And I think that's just common with all movies. I mean, even The Godfather is not a super fast-paced movie, but it's the pacing and the rhythm of the movie is operatic, is grandiose. That's why the themes of the movie resonate and why it's so engaging to so many people. 2001, I think, it works for a lot of people in the same way, where it doesn't really have a story, but people find it hypnotic. Why? Because of the pacing combined with that visual imagery, but it also has to do with how the film sort of lulls you to sleep or lulls you into a trance. And in this way, this is a heavy metal, kick-ass kind of a movie that throws you into the pit and says, go. I mean, even sometimes George Miller is manipulating frames to make the action either speed up or slow down, to make you either understand it, or if something's too slow, to speed it up, because he's so interested in the rhythm of the film. So ultimately, whether it be the sort of long chase sequence near the beginning, on foot, to getting into the cars, to the eventual, I guess, climax, where there's all of the cars kind of coming after them before they finally escape, and all the practical effects that they're doing. It's unlike a movie I've ever seen. It's completely unique. It's original, even though it's a fourth movie. It's a kick-ass movie. If you haven't seen Mad Max Fury Road, what are you doing? It's just a great movie, and I've seen the black and white version. I don't like it as much because I really like those deep saturated oranges that you get in the color version, so I recommend probably the color version, but still, check it out because it's a great movie. And my number 3 pick is going to go to Inception.
This was not a part of the plan! Wake me up! Wake me up!
If Fast 5 is an action movie, then Inception is also an action movie because it is the ultimate heist movie. So I consider that an action movie, and I think that Inception, while it hasn't been talked about maybe critically, I still think within the general public, especially within Christopher Nolan fans, who's the most popular filmmaker, is one of the most defining movies of this decade without a doubt. And this is his blank check that totally cashes. It totally doesn't bounce. It makes a bunch of money and allows him to be the definitive director that he's known today, and why people still come to his movies. And he's really the last filmmaker in a certain respect to make these big, epic, original blockbusters, because his movies make money and people show up. Even something like Interstellar, even something like Dunkirk, people come and his movies make a lot of money, even though they're not based on all these existing properties, which is so inspiring to, I think, a lot of people. And Inception is this great sort of combination where, first, I think it starts as a great script. Oftentimes, if we look at something like a Mad Max, it doesn't have a great script, but it's really great for its pure action, that pure cinema elements. But Inception is great for its, I guess, last third act, really, but I think the first two acts don't get maybe enough credit. Oftentimes, Christopher Nolan is more interested in the set piece, in the build-up to the final amazing montage sequence that he is with the other elements of the story. For example, character motivation and things like that. But sometimes, but I think that's, some people are not as interested into that, but I think when the emotion does work, as in this movie, I actually think it's even more emotionally rewarding and even more of an amazing experience, where I appreciate a movie like Dunkirk because it's all that. It's all the sort of last act of Inception, intercutting, tense, totally almost silent film-esque. But I do think it actually lacks some of the emotion that I do get from something like an Interstellar. But for Inception, what's great is that I actually do care about the emotions, and I think that's built up because of the first two acts. The last third act is the heist, because it's a heist movie, and that's sort of the payoff that Nolan is looking for. But the first two acts, due to the structure of the heist movie, are still very interesting. First of all, through the audience conduit of Ellen Page, you see the world. You see Cobb and him explaining this idea of dreams and being able to go inside dreams and extract information, and then maybe you can go dreams within dreams, Inception. So just being explaining the world in that first act is so interesting. It's totally unique. Some people think, oh, dreams have to be like David Lynch-esque dreams, but maybe dreams are just what Inception is doing, slight versions of reality, but some things are slightly wrong and a little bit out of whack. So we have that interesting first act where you're so engaged with everything. Then, of course, you have that second act where it's a heist movie, because now we have to assemble the team. You have the great ensemble of literally some of the best actors: Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Tom Hardy, Ken Watanabe. These are just an incredible group of guys, and they all have their certain subsects. So then the second act is all about planning. They're talking about totems and certain more explanation and exposition about the rules, but it is definitely one of those movies where it makes dumb people feel smart. Now, I think that's a term that has been used negatively in a lot of ways, that, dumb people think they're smart when they're watching a movie, but I think that is actually a really positive term. I think that means that you were able to convey something that's very complicated and make it seem very clear and obvious to a large portion of the people. Now, a lot of people say, oh, you have to watch this movie 4 or 5 times to really get it. I actually think more of the times you rewatch it, the more you get it, the more rewarding it is. But I still think it works really well on that first watch, that there is these nuggets of information that you can understand, but for the most part, it does make you understand the complexities of this sort of world that Christopher Nolan has built up. So then you have that heist, and you're sort of getting everyone ready, and you're getting all the skills, and that sort of is a great build-up to the final third act, which is what I've been teasing this time, but it really is one of the most incredible pieces of filmmaking of this decade, where Christopher Nolan is intercutting between different times within different levels of the dream, where there's this constant time threat of, you have 4 hours in this dream era, but then you have to make sure another person in the other dream has to stay awake to make sure everyone else doesn't get waken up, but then people are chasing after them, and then of course they're in the truck, the van that they're going around and driving around, and just that intercutting is so complex and so unique, and just a pure example of montage kind of filmmaking in this epic sense, while keeping this idea of time and that race against time and literally life and death stakes. It's a heist within a mind. It's a brilliant idea. It's executed amazingly. It's an incredible heist movie. And then the emotion I talked about earlier with Marion Cotillard's character and Cobb's character, Leonardo DiCaprio's character Cobb, and his relationship with his children, and what is real and what is not real, and makes you think in that sense. The ending is just incredible, like, wow, like, that's great, and it's an awesome ending that, makes you think and makes you want to go back, and there's a reason why it has such an everlasting impact of people my generation. So the film's ideas are so unique and interesting that you want to go back. It has the emotionality of, the ex-wife or the struggling wife, or what's the past, and the past is being revealed throughout the movie, and his relationship with his children. And then, of course, that great ending, and then the incredible piece of filmmaking of the final sort of third act with everyone, and just Christopher Nolan doing this amazing piece of cross-cutting of going in between these different time dream-like areas. And I mean, if you want to talk about visual iconography, what about that incredible city sort of bending up that was imitated in Doctor Strange? What about the rotating hallway that Joseph Gordon-Levitt is fighting in? Of course, using a practical set. Inception has already created so much influence. I mean, even something to the boom, which was used in so many of the trailers, or I think Christopher Nolan's palette in a lot of ways, where it's sort of this dark, gritty, but sort of slick, Michael Mann-esque kind of a palette that has really aged very well, and it is so imitated in so many ways, which is why Inception looks like it was released, yesterday. It's a movie that's held up throughout these 10 years. It's a movie that's easy to reflect back on in terms of its legacy in cinema. It's a great movie that I really love, and this is the number 3 action movie of the decade. And my number 2 pick of the top 10 action movies of the 2010s is going to go to Captain America: Civil War.
Sorry, Tony. You know I wouldn't do this if I had any other choice. But he's my friend. So was I.
Now, I wouldn't consider all Marvel movies action movies, but this is my Marvel entry on this list. I would consider, Captain America: Winter Soldier, of course, an action movie. Black Panther, I group into that. Age of Ultron, maybe even Ant-Man. But something like Thor: Ragnarok, I wouldn't maybe consider an action movie. So this isn't going to be maybe the only Marvel movie on the series of lists, but that's in a lot of reasons, because I think not only am I a big Marvel movie fan, I think if you're a fan of movies right now, you're a fan of the Marvel movies, because if you're not, you're missing out, in my opinion, on one of the most experimental, unique, epic, interesting things that are going on in film right now. I mean, the journey that's going on. If you're missing out, you're just missing out on movies, period, in my opinion. But what the MCU has really done, it's kind of crazy to think about in this decade. Of course, starting off in 2008, actually, with Iron Man, to finally culminate with this Infinity Saga, ending in 2019 with Avengers Endgame, a 23-run journey. It was an just epic feat of filmmaking, but it's also often forgotten that, if Harry Potter is the defining franchise of maybe the 2000s, or I would say maybe Lord of the Rings, the MCU is without a doubt the defining franchise of this decade, and a lot of the movies are, if not action movies, have action sequences in them. So to even leave this off the list or not even have this high would be almost counterintuitive to the entire idea of the MCU. But why I chose Captain America: Civil War instead of maybe the consensus pick of Winter Soldier or some of these other movies is because, as much as I love something like an Avengers Endgame, that's sort of the grand finale, we often forget that Captain America: Civil War was a sort of first real conflict within, and real unique exploration within the franchise. And I think a lot of people relate to something like Winter Soldier because they can say, oh, it's a great movie, you can watch it with anyone, you don't even have to watch really the first Captain America, it's a great sort of 70s spy thriller within this Marvel movie sequence. And I think, yeah, it's great, it's an awesome spy movie, but if we're talking about the best Marvel movies, the best MCU movies, to me, so much of the joy and pleasure that I get from the MCU movies is that the payoff has already been set up. The conflict, central conflict of Captain America: Civil War is the consequences of all the other previous movies. So you have that emotionality that I wouldn't necessarily maybe recommend Captain America, I wouldn't recommend Avengers Endgame, for example, to someone who's never watched a Marvel movie, because I think you're losing out on a lot of that emotionality. But I'm not going to knock that. I'm not the same way I'm not going to knock Captain America: Civil War, because the reward of the MCU movies is watching all of them and then going to here, You could say a great episode of TV is one that could be watched individually, but that season finale is the one that's the most emotionally rewarding, because you watch a TV show, you watch every single episode to finally get to those moments. Those are the moments you ultimately like, not the one-offs, that are really singular. For me, it's always the ones that build on some of the other previous films, and that's what I think Captain America: Civil War does brilliantly. Like I said, and it talks about the consequences of all the previous films, which is something that they've, of course, done in comic books, but we've never really seen in films because we haven't been able to do this huge, these this huge franchise. We had the destruction of Sokovia in Age of Ultron, which was really propelling the reason for this film. And for the first time, we have a division between the characters. Sidney Pollack, the great filmmaker, once said that a good film is two sides of a good argument. And I think Captain America Civil War is the embodiment of that statement. It is looking at the sort of Iron Man side versus the Captain America side, understanding their choices and understanding that philosophical idea, which I think will be interesting to anyone, because you don't have to necessarily understand all the other movies to understand their motivations. Iron Man's motivations make sense because you've seen the other movies because of what's happened to him. Same way with Captain America. He went through the Nazi Germany thing. He doesn't want this incredible control that, you know, he won't be able to do his job, which is almost counterintuitive to Captain America's nature. So for the very first time, we have a conflict, a true understanding that there's disagreements of how they're going to go forward. So in one sense, it's a intellectual sort of debate, but then, of course, later on, the emotions come into it. And as much as I talk about how cool the John Wick action movies are, or, you know, how some of these great stunt works are, and something like Mad Max, the best action for me is action where you actually care about the characters, where you're invested in their stakes and in their storytelling, that, you know, you care about Indiana Jones because you don't want him to die because you see his vulnerability, you understand that he has to get with Marion, and, you know, he's fighting the Nazis. You sort of feel and sympathize, and there's emotional stakes within the storytelling, which I think someone like Steven Spielberg, who's an incredible action filmmaker, was able to do. And this has all these amazing, great action sequences, but every action sequence, every line of dialogue is delivered with an incredible melancholic sense in so many ways. Whether it be the sort of, I guess, tentpole action sequences I'm thinking about is sort of the very first one near the beginning with Cap and Bucky and Black Panther, and they're going through the streets there, and it's an incredible chase with some great stunt work. And that's awesome because Bucky's not fully there. We've seen that he sort of got there in Winter Soldier, but Captain America's still trying to get him and try to realize that, you know, he's not the Winter Soldier. He's been brainwashed that he is Bucky, his longtime friend. So there's an emotionality there that we've been building up throughout the other films. Black Panther, of course, his father dies early in the film, so now he's really just trying to kill the Winter Soldier. So there's sort of a love triangle, but now sort of a complex with these three characters. That's just one element, so that's the emotionality there. And then, of course, in the final end sequence with it, Captain America, Bucky, and Iron Man, they're trading blows. They're you know, bruised and battered and bloody. They're almost going to die. You don't know what's happening. You're on the edge of your seat. You know, this is intense and incredible filmmaking, and a beautiful shot of they're at the Zemo's lab, and I'm thinking with the pillars and the white sort of snowy background, and you're holding in that wide there, and you have Bucky and Cap sort of switching blows, going against Iron Man. He's doing his moves. I mean, it's an incredible, just cinematic image that has totally resonated with me. And within that action scene, every blow, every punch has this incredible weight of emotions that's been built up throughout the film, but I think built out without the story through revelations that we see. But ultimately, I think the best action sequence, and one of the best sequences in film in the 2010s, is the airport battle with the whole squad, with the sort of final showdown between Team Cap and Team Iron Man, where there has that emotionality of, you know, Black Widow sort of throwing her punches against Clint, of course, you know, the Spider-Man. Of course, I mean, I haven't even talked about that. The introduction of Spider-Man coming here, him going around Ant-Man and going around his legs, and sort of the comedic timing that he brings to the film, that an otherwise really weighted film. Everyone gets their moment. There's these singular action sequences. They work together. They're fighting against each other. You know, you never really see this in any other movie. It's a unique film in the fact that we wouldn't be able to see it because you'd have to have all of that build up to finally bring up these topics of responsibility within the movies, to finally bring up the topic of disagreements, to have actual philosophical beliefs that allow them, they actually have to fight each other, brings an incredible tension to the film, but also makes them stronger for later films to come. It's a brilliant piece of filmmaking. The final, like I said, that final airport sequence with everyone fighting, of every hero smartly using things and introducing things like Giant Man with Ant-Man, and even there's actually Riddle with a bunch of film references from Raging Bull and things like that in that sequence, which is pretty funny. Ultimately, it's something that I don't think I would have ever seen if you have gone on that journey and that you see Captain America Civil War, it has incredible emotions within every single fight. You care about all the characters. There's unique, interesting philosophical debates that you can think about throughout the movie. And then ultimately, these amazing, awesome action sequences using powers and using sort of a rhythm to create you edge of your seat filmmaking that is totally unique to, I think, Marvel movies, and I think Captain America Civil War, as a result, is one of the best Marvel movies for that reason. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned to next week to stay and hear my #1 pick. It's going to be about a 10-minute video, maybe a little bit longer, on my favorite action movie of the decade. Maybe you have some thoughts I've missed. I haven't mentioned a couple big ones, so it could be something or next. I'd like to hear your comments, maybe your guesses in the comments down below. Some of your favorite action movies, I'd love to hear that as well. That's about it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.